We are delighted to have Tim Feemster, the Managing Principal of Foremost Quality Logistics, with over 35 years of experience in site selection and economic development strategy consulting, DC network optimization, third-party logistics services selection, and strategic planning. Tim has been a manager in 3 manufacturing companies, a consultant, an executive in 2 outsourced logistics organizations, and a practice group leader for 2 real estate companies. He is a frequent presenter and is quoted regularly in both the supply chain and real estate press. We are delighted to have him here with us today. I am Elisa Sklar. I am the marketing director here at GIS Planning, and I will be taking some questions from the audience at the end. So feel free to type them into the question panel if you would like to, and we'll try and get to them at the end. We will also be sending you out a follow-up email with a recording of the presentation afterwards. So I will return this back to Tim. Thank you again for joining us. I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate GIS Planning putting this together, and thank you for taking time in your busy schedules on a Monday to do this. So we want to talk today a little bit about understanding logistics in the corporate site selection process. So profits leverage discussion. I'm going to talk about this because I think it's important for everybody on the phone to understand why people in my profession, and I'm a supply chain person, as I've already been introduced as such, but why that's important. Because let's say your president talks to a president, we'll do as a kind of an example, talks to his VP of sales and his VP of operations and supply chain about their annual goals and objectives. And you know how that works. They usually talk to them and they tell you what they are rather than you figure them out that they are. So the president says to the VP of sales, I want a 5% increase in sales next year. And he says to the VP of ops and supply chain, I want a 5% reduction in overall costs next year. So, you know, who do you think has a better chance of making this happen? Well, I come out of the supply chain world, and I know every time you hear about a company being in trouble, what do? They go out and they try to cut costs. They're not focused on a sales increase mode. But let's say they would be both successful. Who do you think should get a bigger bonus based on how much they might impact profitability? So next slide tells us that answer, in my opinion. Okay, again, these are my opinions. Bottom line impact of a 5% increase in sales is substantially reduced by cost of goods sold, whereas a 5% reduction in costs goes right to the bottom line. So how do I mean that? And I'll show you an example now. So here's our baseline. So you have $100 million in sales, let's say. That's 100 million net sales dollars, a $90 million cost of goods sold, and a $10 million profit, or a 10% margin firm. Okay. So now the sales manager says, okay, I'm going to get my 5% increase in sales. This is how it impacts the P&L. So you get your $5 million increase in sales to get a net sales of 105 and a cost of goods sold of 94.5. Therefore, you have a profit of $10.5 million, or an improvement of $500,000. Okay. So the supply chain and cost person doesn't get any increase in sales, let's say, but they do get the $5 million in cost decrease. That generates a profit of total for the firm of $15 million, which means there's a $5 million profit. So you can see that the reality is cost leverage results in a much larger return than a sales increase, about 10x in this case, where you've got the person who gets a 10% margin. So that's why folks in the supply chain world and in most areas actually focus on cost reduction to generate increased revenues. And virtually in my career, every year I had cost savings reduction goals and objectives in the supply chain world. So that's kind of the premise for a lot of the things I'm going to talk about here today. So the average, what's a nickel worth today? In today's world, everybody's going to say, well, that's not worth very much. But let's say you're trying to get $500,000 in cost, or $500,000 in cost savings, and that's worth an equivalent, as we saw just in the previous example, $1 million worth of sales improvement. So as you look at folks coming to you as an economic development, looking for incentives, looking for cost reductions in tax abatements or things like that, you wonder why. And and you folks that might be out there talking about a building you might own and saying, well, how come people come after me and they keep looking for a nickel in the rent rate, right? Well, here's why. The profit of a cost reduction of a nickel per square foot on a 1 million square foot building is equal to that $1 million in sales for the new company. So that generates that $50,000 to the bottom line. So that's why it's important to everybody to think about the cost savings potential in profitability impact versus sales increases. So what drives costs in a supply chain environment? Basically, I've got critical trends identified here in 4 major categories. So there are strategic ones, there are financial ones, operational ones, and really intangible ones. I'm not going to talk about every one of these today because we only have a half an hour so a little bit more than that. So, but I will talk about several of them. So there's things on here like sustainability, e-commerce, foreign trade zones that are very critical to an organization and how they structure them. We're going to talk about transportation and drayage being the transportation cost of moving a container from a railhead to a distribution center, or from a port to a railhead, or from a port to a chassis truck. We'll talk about other things in terms of incentives. Operational costs, the rising cost of fuel, we'll maybe talk about, if we get a chance, talk about driver hours of service and things like that, trucking capacity. But on the intangible side, there's also things like brand reputation, unionization, and that relates to economic development folks in states as it relates to right to work, and quality of life issues that always come up in business climate, because that is important. You'll see in my top 10 at the end. So let's talk about the relative costs of goods movement. By goods movement, I mean transportation, basically. So if I think of supply chain as a pipeline, you see the green pipe along there, and there are basically 4 modes of transportation existing in the world. There's water, there's rail, there's truck, and there's air. So you can see here, I've kind of visualized this like a restaurant is assessed on how expensive they are by the dollar signs, but the cheapest way to ship product is by water, and that gives you the lowest cost per box or per ton. The next cheapest being rail, double stack rail or rail boxcar. These aren't linear, but I've used the dollar signs to give you the idea. Truckload, that being moving a truck from one point to another without stopping the truck and loading and unloading partials, would be the $3 signs. Less than truckload would be people like your yellow freights, your FedEx freight, where you pick up a smaller portion of freight, be it 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds maybe even, and you move it around at a lower level. And then there's Big Brown and FedEx and the United States Postal Service, which actually ship parcels, obviously. Small packages less than 70 pounds, onesie, twosies. And then, no pun intended necessarily, in the stratosphere, there's air freight, which is, again, got $6 signs, but is significantly more expensive than the others. So as a supply chain person looks at where to site a distribution center or how to manage their supply chain, going back to that cost leverage, they want to have, if possible, the lowest cost solution to reach the client in the right amount of time. So they want to ship it by the lowest cost method for the longest distances. Okay? So that means that you would try to ship it by ship if you've got that option, ship it by rail if you've got that option, ship it by truckload if you've got that option, or if you're just in this e-commerce business, you're going to ship it by small package and less than truckload and air freight. But that's a very high cost distribution center system versus the other. So again, that's the idea. So how does that affect a trend in shipping and in port activity? It's a big talk now. We've outsourced a ton of our products to China for production, or even Asia. We also outsourced to Canada some of it. We also outsourced it to Mexico some of it. We've also outsourced some of it to Europe and around the globe. But here's how those containers that carry that finished good production enter the United States. These are the top container ports in the United States and in North America. And you can see Los Angeles and Long Beach, California are at the top of the list as being the biggest. Okay? all the way down to Prince Rupert in Canada, which is the smallest that I show on my chart, but it's growing very rapidly, because you can see it increased 46.9% versus last year in 2012 versus 2011. Long Beach and Oakland did have reductions in volume last year, but the Long Beach one was mainly, and Seattle, Tacoma too, mainly because of moving product from Long Beach to Los Angeles in terms of steamship lines moving their ports of call. So they're color-coded on the previous chart by East Coast, West Coast, and Gulf Coast, because I wanted to talk about the potential impact of the Panama Canal expansion coming up in 2015. And as you can see on this chart, that shift between West Coast ports, which are reflected on the right-hand side in purple, has moved from 2006, the percentage of container traffic through the ports of West Coast, from 58% of the total container volume coming into the ports that were previously mentioned, down to 53% in this last year. And that has been because of the 2002 lockout of the longshoremen. The retailers of this country realized they couldn't put all their eggs in the basket of the West Coast to bring all the goods into the West Coast. They had to mitigate their risk of supply chain interruption and out-of-stock potentials because of that, because they had that 10-day lockout. And they, in fact, did experience some stockouts at retail, which is a cardinal sin if you're in the retailer business, to be out of stock at retail. So they've already started to make those shifts. The Walmarts, the Targets of the world have gone to 4 or 5 corner strategies. So Walmart now brings product in from Southern California. They bring it to the Port of Houston, where they put in 4 million square feet of warehousing. In Savannah, Port of Savannah, 2 million square feet, and the Port of Virginia, they've got 5 million square feet there that are international import centers where they store product coming in from Asia and Europe and South America. So that shift has already taken place. I think when the Panama Canal opens to bigger ships in the future, that shift is going to continue to tick down, probably only get to about a 50-50 percentage point. But that it does affect how people look at their distribution networks, because the point of entry does affect the cost structure, as I showed you before on the previous pipe chart. If they can bring it all the way around all water to the East Coast at a lower cost per unit, and then bring it into Norfolk or bring it into Savannah or Charleston or an eastern port, even the Port of New York, obviously, that can be the lowest cost to bring it in, as long as they've got the time to do it. So that's why that shift is going to take place. And the next slide shows you where the population is the United States. Therefore, that's where the imports are going to be going to for finished goods consumption. And that finished goods consumption is going to be in a market where the people live. So 77% of the population lives east of that blue line, basically being the Texas and the Midwest area east of the United States. And 80% of the population east in that 77% lives within 250 miles of the coastline. So that's why you can bring it all water into Houston and Charleston and Hampton Roads in New York and get to 80% of the East Coast population just by bringing it by ship and then putting it on a truck and delivering it to the distribution center, where it eventually goes to the store. The West Coast has the 23%. So that's why people are coming to the East Coast now. Besides the risk mitigation, is because that's where the population is, and as long as they can stand the inventory costs by floating it on a boat instead of bringing it across the country by rail, they have a lower cost solution to get to the market. So one of the other things that affects cost of transportation and therefore cost of supply chain is fuel. Obviously, everybody on the phone either drives a car or takes public transportation, which tends to go up over time. And you see here the cost of diesel has had an interesting rise and fall. And back in 2008 and 2009, when we had the recession, it reached its peak of $4.76 a gallon, and its trough down there at $2 a gallon in 2009. But you can see also on the right-hand side of the graph, the average cost for diesel has been going up and up and up, and our average so far this year just dipped under the 2012 average, because diesel has dropped the last few weeks but had been increasing prior to that. Everybody knows what's going on with the price of gas at the gas pump, but that has a significant impact on transportation cost, which is then passed on to the consumers through the retailers in the price of goods. So goods have gone up. But how does that affect networks? This slide 14 shows you. This is a study done by Levy at MIT, and it shows that at $75 a barrel, the proper network for this company, because of their mix of LTL and truckload, less than truckload and rail and etc. At $75 a barrel, that network included 5 nodes. Those were Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, New York, and Las Vegas. And you can see on the left side of the screen, the Las Vegas portion, there's long lines going to service Seattle, Tacoma, and even LA Long Beach out of Las Vegas. As you see the price of gas going up, diesel going up over to $150 a barrel, the right-hand screen showed a more cost-effective distribution network for that company, and that is eliminating Las Vegas and adding the Albuquerque and LA and Portland to the mix. And although they would spend more money in rent, more money in labor, and more money in inventory, they would spend less money overall in their total cost because the transportation costs is significantly impacted by that cost of fuel. Okay, and the next slide kind of shows you why economic development people need to be interested in this concept of supply chain and the cost structure, because Project Soccer here, a 1 million square foot site, the CFO of the company said 2 major, most significant factors are labor and logistics in their cost structure of Continental Tire. And this next slide shows the same thing. Caterpillar, when they looked to go into Athens, Georgia, that was where their final site was, minimizing logistics costs to our domestic and export customers, puts Caterpillar in a better position to meet overall business goals and objectives. So people are looking at cost, and they're looking at cost significantly. Another in transportation, another element of trend is e-commerce. This chart shows you that the one that I look at is the second bullet point that talks about within 5 years, Deloitte is saying that today 91% of goods sold, consumer goods, are sold through brick and mortar channels, and they expect that to drop to 76% in 5 years. You can see the progression here from 2011, the expectation, the future goal of e-commerce. The reason that's important for economic development and owners of real estate space is because it's a completely different element to put a distribution center in for e-commerce than it is to put a distribution center to service retail stores. E-commerce is very small, mainly, as I said before, the small package delivery. Most e-commerce orders, if you order from Amazon, which everybody on the phone probably has, you'll note that you may order 1 or 2 items at a time. Seldom do you order thousands of items like the store would get replenished every week from the retailer's distribution center. So they ship a whole truckload to go to the store with thousands of cases on it. They ship 1 or 2 boxes to you. Even if they have 2 items, they probably ship it in 1 box. So that's a whole different distribution network. It's a whole different inside the 4 walls, where it's a significant investment in mechanization to make that distribution efficient. So it's important to understand whether the company is looking at you get an RFP, is it an e-commerce company or is it a non-e-commerce company, because that'll give you a feel for how that distribution is going to take place out of that building and what's important to look at in whether you've got a chance to win that business or not. So, with logistics cost breakdown, every time you look at a vertical that many people on the phone have got specific verticals. They may be targeting alternative energy. They may be targeting biotech. They may be targeting industrial and distribution. They may be targeting all kinds of things, call centers or data centers, or right in the financial arena even. It's important to understand the cost structure of the supply of the vertical that you're looking at. Here's a graph that gives you a breakdown of the cost structure of a typical supply chain in the industry. A little bit older chart here that I'm going to update here in the next slide, but you see over 50% of the cost of supply chain is transportation. Getting back to that point I talked about in the beginning, when fuel goes up, more distribution centers, smaller distribution centers closer to market, Labor and customer service around 17%. Rent is down at 4.3%, and your taxes and incentives, your taxes and that sort of costs are down here on the far right-hand side. So you see, when it comes to supply chain and cost focus, where it's important to make sure that a particular node is located in the right place to minimize that transportation expense. That's what's important there. And here's one broken down by vertical in the supply chain world. And you can see on the left side, high tech, that newer number coming up from Chainalytics, showed that 60% of that cost of that supply chain in the high tech world is transportation, either inbound or outbound. And over here on the far right-hand side, for a food and beverage company, it might be as high as 88%. Think about that as to, in your moving water around, why there's a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi-Cola bottler in every town, because all they do is ship in the cans and the syrup and the bottles, and they ship out the finished product. They need to ship that water the shortest distance they possibly can, because it's very expensive to ship, and it's very dense and heavy. So that's impact on cost. The leverage of the whole supply chain cost structure is critical, because most of the cost structure is defined at the strategic level. Okay, when I said before that that supply chain, over 50% of the cost of supply chain is transportation. That's 63% last year, and we're waiting until this week to get the new numbers for this year. A brand new study is going to come out the middle of this week, but this study by Gartner and AMR showed that when you put an address on a building, you're basically committing, you see on the right-hand side under the value, 80% of the cost structure of that supply chain is going to be fixed once you put an address on that building. So it's important for the user of that facility to make sure that they've looked at the logistics cost from a supply chain transportation cost, they've looked at the labor cost, and then they need to look at the community impact. Because once they put that address on that building, they can only deal and make changes in about 20% of their cost structures through operational changes. The strategic is where you have to go back and look. And that's why it's important when people are doing RFPs and people are looking for sites that they look at it strategically first and then focus down in on the lower level details to get down to the bottom line. And to look at total costs also. It's one of the things, you can't do it just based on incentive costs or just based on taxes or just based on transportation expenses. It needs to be the whole cost structure that comes into play, because that's what's going to generate that 80% cost structure that you're not going to be able to change once you put that down as an address. So if you look at overall site selection, you're looking at, as a site selector, look at this, location screening for industrial manufacturing processes. Those of us in site selection, we tend to be site eliminators, not site selectors. So I've looked at the left side of this showing, first pass of fatal flaws, and you're looking like you're going through a funnel, okay? And the right side reflects the elements that are going on at the time that this funnel is getting narrower and narrower and narrow till you get down to the bottom where you've got the short list of preferred sites. And it's at that level, at the end of the process, that things like incentives and tax abatements and even overall tax structures tend to come in play. Because again, as you saw from my previous chart, those are very, very small impacts as a percentage of the total dollars compared to transportation and labor. But in the end, when the transportation and labor are basically in sync, so your final two locations have to have that virtually the same answer for my transportation and labor total costs, now it comes down to other individual elements that are going to make the tipping scale. Folks in economic development always talk to me about, well, we've got great incentives and we've got this and that. My point is that you can't overcome a bad transportation cost decision with incentives. I'll give you an example. Circuit City built a 750,000 square foot building in Ardmore, Oklahoma, which is just north of the border from Texas. And they got free land from Ardmore, and they got tax abatements for 10 years, and they got probably free rent for a year or two from the company that built the building, and they probably got about, let's say they got $2.50 a square foot rent on the 750,000 square foot building. Well, the real estate guy probably got a huge bonus and promoted because he was a hero. The supply chain guy then had to now import 15,000 containers of goods from Asia, and he brought them into the BNSF intermodal yard in Alliance, Texas, Fort Worth, and for a cost of $6 million a year, brought them up from Alliance, Texas to Ardmore, Oklahoma. That's that drayage cost I mentioned before. So his net effective rent in that building, $8 a foot for the drayage cost, plus the rent he paid was probably about $10 a foot. If that building had been located in Alliance, Texas, they could have cut that $6 million transportation fee down to probably about $500,000. No amount of incentives on the part of the state of Oklahoma and Ardmore overcame that $6 million incremental penalty, because that goes on every year. It's not just the first year, so it goes on every year. So that's why that's important, that incentives come in at the end, and they are very important because of that cost leverage again, and also to make the ROI for the project. But they don't make a decision about whether something goes from the top of the slide to the next level, typically. They don't come into play until the end. So there's also an element for economic development folks that people in my world do, is called reverse site selection, to try to determine in your community, again, from an industrial perspective, okay, what your sites would be best suited for, if they are best suited for industrial and or manufacturing purposes, therefore what categories and industries, and therefore what companies should you target to do a rifle marketing program instead of a shotgun approach. So that's just the opposite, using the user's information, going backwards in the scheme of things to make sure you've got the right focus in your marketing efforts for the sites that you have available. So, my top 10 list for warehouse and distribution of the things that are most important. You can imagine number one is transportation costs, both inbound and outbound. Logistics infrastructure is critical. You need to have the phrase 5 to 55 in your mind. You know, most companies that are going to be traveling much of a distance are going to want to get to 55 miles an hour within 5 minutes, because time is money. That hours of service, the driver can only drive 10 or 11 hours, depending on whether it's now or 3 months from now, if the courts allow the reduction in time for the driver. Labor costs and availability. It's important that the labor is trained in the elements of the requirements. Even in a warehouse today, those folks have to be using the handheld computers, and it's just not a low-level job as it was before. And the supply chain interruption we've talked about. And here's where the economic development folks come in, is their love in the community, because that business climate is very important for a person in the supply chain world. The reason is because if a company is prohibited from operating like they need to operate, so let's say it's a Walmart distribution center, that they've got to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which means trucks are coming in and out of that distribution center all the time. If it's untenable for the town, or there's going to get a lot of pushback in public meetings around trucks going through town at midnight, then they can't operate. So it doesn't matter how cheap it is. If to do that, then either out of business. But anyway, so then you see your taxes and incentives come in as you come down the list. Utility rates in distribution centers, if they're not air conditioned or refrigerated, utility rates tend to be not as important because they're not big users. Typically, you'll see on my manufacturing one, they're more expensive and they're more important. But access to public transportation is a new one. That's tougher for rural communities to deal with, but a lot of times companies are asking communities to be able to provide public transportation into these business parks and that sort of thing, so people can get to work when their cars don't work. And then the top 10 site selection for manufacturing. Labor costs and availability. The trained labor for manufacturing is critical. They have to have the right skills. Then comes transportation. And you can see utility rates tend to pop up really high in this one because they tend to be bigger users of utilities, gas and or electricity or both. And the public transportation is still on there. So, what the future holds, I think, this is again Tim Feemster at Foremost Quality Logistics talking, but mobile commerce and e-commerce will explode, and I think that's going to affect your operations in your cities. And don't forget, as that trend continues, it's not just the distribution centers and the distribution network that's going to change. It's also your retail storefronts are going to change, because maybe Best Buy doesn't need 25,000 square feet anymore if 25% of their business is going to go by the internet. Maybe they only need 20 or 15. Well, now you're going to have to deal with how do we, as a community, deal with the smaller footprint of a lot of our retailers. We got to fill that space now in those strip malls and in those big malls. So that's why it's important to read this, and I think you're going to have the access to these slides as you go through this thing, and would be able to repeat this back. So this is all there. But you know, the aging population is another issue because of the labor constraints, and especially in the logistics world. An awful lot of truck drivers are going to be retiring in the next 10 years. And here's one at the bottom that I think you folks ought to look at if you haven't, and that is especially as you are getting to, maybe you're in the ownership business in the economic development world of buildings, but the rules for lease accounting is going to change probably in 2015. That is going to make a decision for a lot of companies. They're going to have to capitalize leases even if they don't take out the lease, even if a third-party logistics company or an outsourced logistics company takes out the lease. So that's just an ancillary one that's going to be that's going to come into play here down the road that people need to remember and look up to. We didn't talk about sustainability much, but it's a big issue in most companies today because as it affects the lighting and energy use of the building, and as it affects the HVAC systems in the offices and ever to make sure they're Energy Star and T5 or T8 lighting in buildings. There's an awful lot of companies today that won't sign a lease in a building unless the landlord or the owner will upgrade the lighting to be energy efficient lighting, because that drops their energy usage to about 35% of what it was. Remember that cost leverage at the beginning. If he's currently spending $10,000 a month on energy in a building, and he can go to a building where it's only $3,500 a month, that $6,500 a month drops to the bottom line as profit. It's very important. So with that, open it up for questions, and hopefully we have some. If I'm still on the line and talking to people.
You are. Thank you.
It's been quiet out there.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was really fascinating. I have to say, a lot of stuff to think about, a lot of food for thought. We are happy to take some questions from the attendees. I have a couple that have come in. Maybe you could answer for us.
Sure.
What do you think about the regionalization of economic development organizations?
Well, I think a regionalization is a critical success element for economic development folks, especially in for smaller communities to be able to band together. One of those, remember the chart that showed the fatal flaw scenario on the left-hand side at the top? One of those fatal flaws tends to be population and or labor availability, and I know up in the Northeast, Massachusetts and Connecticut combined to make what they call the knowledge corridor. And with that adjusted MSA, they got over 1 million people. Well, when you're going for corporate reloads and things like that, that tends to be a fatal flaw that they want to be over 1 million or over 2 million or over 3 million. I mean, who knows what it is, but that will allow the community through their state and or even directly to get RFPs from site selectors where they qualify because they're big enough, okay? Mm-hmm. Whereas on their own, they would never get that through the state and or through the through a direct site selector because they weren't big enough from an MSA standpoint of population. That's really the most critical point for it. But it's also they're able to band together to help sell their region for a project. And one of the things that I find that's really important in that is that even if you don't win the project in your small community, the reality is there's going to be probably a lot of people living in your community that will commute to that site for the work. So you get an ancillary impact, even if it goes into the region, but not in your city. Okay? So I think that's really important to do that and to make sure that you stay connected and you stay in sync as you go through that RFP process and not try to jump around the chain of command to try to get an advantage for your own individual community, because the site selector will find that out and they will see that, and that doesn't resonate too well.
Okay, interesting. Okay, can we take time for one more question here, if that's all right? We have a couple more, but let's see. I think we're a little over time. Let's see what we can get a hold of. One is, does your 80% rule hold true for short-term leases?
80% rule. Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, the 80% rule on strategy. Well, it's mitigated somewhat, but the problem you have there is that there's a cost to move. Typically, moving is not free, right? So if it's in community A and their cost structure is not acceptable, okay, they're probably going to end up moving at some point in time because that's going to get on the radar screen. And if it gets big enough on the radar screen, their corporate or their headquarters is going to start looking at that and saying, well, now it's reached the point where we can move it to another city, and it'll cost us to move, but we'll get that 2-year ROI that we need to pay off the fact that it's moved, but the costs are lower to make that work. So short-term leases maybe will make it easier for somebody to move, but moving is still a hard process. It can be, you're putting critical intellectual capital at risk by leaving it in one community and having to start over in a new community, so there's chances for hiccups. It's a painful process. I've done it. I've helped people move 100 times in my career, which is 100 times or 99 times more than most people, and it is painful. There's just no question about it. Even the move that goes flawlessly is painful on the organization.
Right. Interesting. We have one more question that looks like a quick one, and let me make sure I'm understanding it correctly because it broke into two, is on the site selection criteria slide, so that was a few back. What did CAM or CAM charges?
Okay, I'm sorry. That's common area maintenance. Right. Yeah. That's a fee that typically an office park that is owned by a particular entity will charge for, like, landscaping of the front end of the park, or signage in the park, or that sort of thing. Common area maintenance. Okay. It's a pretty small charge. That's why it's down there in the bottom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for clarifying. Thank you all for the questions. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you attending Economic Development Online webinar today. Thank you very much to Tim Feemster for presenting a lot of interesting information, some food for thought, giving us kind of an insight into logistics, how it affects the site selection process. And, I think particularly for economic development officers and people who are doing this kind of work, it's really useful for us to have that kind of insight from the other end. So we really value your time and your input here. Reminder to everyone who's attended that we will be sending out an email in the next couple days with a link to a recording of the webinar. And if you have further questions, feel free to get in touch with us at GIS Planning through Economic Development Online, and we will forward them on to Tim as well. So again, thank you very much to all, and keep an eye out for future webinars from Economic Development Online.